welcome. Thank you for joining. I'm all on my own here in the National Archives, which is very strange, but I'm very pleased to be with you all this afternoon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why Edward, Earl of March, ended up fighting a battle against Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, in freezing winter weather near a crossroads on the route from Hereford to Wigmore. And the reasons, the broad reasons are, over the previous 5 years, the breakdown in Henry VI's authority and the consequences of weak leadership provide some context for the hostility of the leaders on each side at Mortimer's Cross. In the same period, the activation of the claim to the throne of Richard, Duke of York, Earl Edward's father, polarized the nation's leaders for or against his cause and started a chain of clashes that added vengeance into an increasingly fractured political picture. This aspect of the descent into the Civil War lingered long in the memory of those affected and took many years to address. The consequences of Mortimer's Cross also lay dormant for longer because Jasper Tudor's family were very much absent from the political scene for the next 30 years. This talk will hint at some areas also where further study might show how the longer legacy of Mortimer's Cross lingered across generations. So during the 1450s, Jasper Tudor built his influence in South Wales through his half-blood connection to King Henry VI. When Jasper was made Earl of Pembroke and his brother Edmund created Earl of Richmond in 1452, they already faced a struggle to assert the crown against the growing influence in Carmarthenshire and Pembrokeshire of Griffith and Nicholas. Further east, William Herbert held power in the Duke of York's lordship of Usk, and the Vaughan family were strong in the Stafford estates around Brecon. With Griffith encroaching into these Marcher areas, there was support nationally to intervene to curb his expansion. And the Duke of York's protectorate for Henry VI sent Edmund Tudor into South Wales in 1456 to subdue Griffith. A year of open warfare followed before Edmund Tudor re-established royal control of castles like Kidwelly and Carmarthen, where the Duke of York was nominal constable. York feared that his presence in South Wales was moving into the hands of the king's half-brother. And in February 1456, York sent his friends, in February 1456, York's protectorate ended and he lost control of government. So he felt that this was an increasing risk to his power down in South Wales. And these factors prompted him to allow his own retainers to head into Wales to protect his interests there. And these were Sir William Herbert of Raglan, his brother-in-law Sir Walter Devereux of Webley, and several Vaughans under Thomas Vaughan, and they led 2,000 men from the Marcher estates into Carmarthen. They took the castle by force from Edmund Tudor and imprisoned him. Herbert and Devereux then moved on to occupy Aberystwyth, and in doing so, they re-established York's authority, but at the expense of the king's Tudor kinsman, already officially tasked with containing Griffith. He recognized this change in power and offered to come to terms with Herbert. But in tasking his followers to do this over the head of Edmund Tudor, York contributed to the breakdown of relationships that would soon bring war into the Marches. Tudor died on the 1st of November 1456 after his release from brief but unjust imprisonment in Carmarthen Castle. Whether this was from ill treatment or disease, it aroused Jasper Tudor's suspicion. He quickly replaced his brother as the king's agent in South Wales. Jasper took over the castles occupied by York's friends, Devereux and Herbert, and they submitted to the king at Coventry under heavy bonds for their good behaviour. Devereux was sent to imprisonment at Windsor Castle, but Herbert soon fled while he was on bail, and throughout the winter of 1456-7, gathered men in York's lordships in the southern Marches. Queen Margaret ensured that a quick pardon for Griffith set the basis for cooperation and understanding with Jasper Tudor further west, which was a good foundation for rapid growth in Tudor's position in that part of Wales. In proclaiming Jasper's prominence, Welsh poets made much of his Welsh ancestry and his French ancestry and his close kinship to King Henry. More practically, he displayed his commitment to his family when he entrusted that his brother's widow, the 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond, was protected in Pembroke Castle once her son Henry was born on the 28th of January 1457. Jasper used the threat of an expansion of the Duke of York's power in South Wales to also build good relations with Humphrey Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. The Stafford lordships at Brecon and Newport were potential targets for Herbert and Devereux. Sorry, I moved on too fast. And the marriage of the Duke's second son, Sir Henry Stafford, to Margaret Beaufort on the 6th of April 1457 cemented this political understanding between Jasper and Buckingham. To sort out some of the issues arising from this mini civil war in South Wales, at the end of March, the King and his court came to Hereford from their base at Coventry. A special judicial commission on the 2nd to the 5th of April investigated the violence seen in the southern marches over the previous 5 years. But in reality, this was a clampdown on the lawlessness shown by the Devereux, Herbert and Vaughan allies during that period, and various allegations emerged. Illegal retaining by livery in Leominster, violent ejection from Humphrey Blunt from property in Ashton by a force of 400 men, illegal imprisonment and extortion of Richard Burgess of Stratford, an attack on the Constable of Leominster, public humiliation of Hereford's Mayor Richard Green in stocks and chains for 2 days at Easter 1456, summary hangings in Hereford at the same time in a campaign of intimidation in the city, and mustering of legal retainers and proclamations of intent to depose the king. Now, this must be taken with a pinch of salt, but it also seems like typical of aristocratic power running off the leash. And in the context of the disturbed national politics at the time, it undermined royal government. The attacks on Carmarthen and Aberystwyth were presented here as treason. Jasper Tudor ensured that the imprisonment and mistreatment of his brother was prominent in the charges. The indictment also gives us an excellent breakdown of the service and marriage links across this Devereux, Herbert and Vaughan affinity. Although the various Herberts and Vaughans spent some time in the Marshalsea prison in London, the Devereux connection around Hereford, Webley and Leominster attracted the most attention. Walter Devereux stayed in Windsor in prison until March 1457. It seems that there was a deliberate attempt to break up this network by offering leniency to some people, but harsher pressure on others. A bounty of £500 for the arrest of Herbert ensured that he surrendered early in June 1457. He obtained a pardon soon after, as did many of his friends, a move that left the Devereux group even more isolated from royal favour. While the commission raked up examples of bullying and intimidation, the pardons and punishments seem to have diffused the growth of more serious violence. In the background, however, were the grudges and memories embedded by this violent misrule. Jasper Tudor certainly seemed unwilling to forgive the men he held duly responsible for the death of his brother and also for the decay in the king's influence in southern Wales and the Marches. Nevertheless, over the next 2 years, he successfully strengthened his control over the towns in southwest Wales before national events from the autumn of 1459 drew him back into the struggle for the crown. Despite a ritual reconciliation between the major lords and the king at the Love Day in London on the 25th of March 1458, the Duke of York and his prominent Neville supporters were suspicious of the intentions behind the Great Council called at Coventry in June 1459, and they refused to travel. Instead, the Yorkist leaders mustered their retinues. York and the Earl of Warwick joined at Worcester with troops from Calais, while Warwick's father, the Earl of Salisbury, headed south from North Yorkshire. At Blore Heath on the 23rd of September, he defeated a larger Crown army sent under Lord Audley to intercept him. Salisbury was able to unite with the others at Ludlow, creating a sizable Yorkist army. And in trying to advance towards the southeast, they were blocked by a large royal retinue that also included the king in person. This put them in a bit of a pickle. The Yorkists drew up an indenture at Worcester, expressing their loyalty, but condemning the evil counsel of Henry's advisors. After the rejection of their appeal, however, the Yorkists had no option but to fall back towards Ludlow with the royal army close behind. A standoff at Ludford Bridge on the 12th of October threatened renewed fighting. The Yorkist force was outnumbered, and having professed loyalty to Henry, they could not justify attacking his banners. Salisbury's troops had also killed men in the king's livery at Blore Heath, and the other captains were not confident that their soldiers would fight. Finally, when Anthony Trollope took the Calais crews from Warwick's ranks over to the Royal Army, York's chief councillors decided they should flee to avoid capture and complete defeat. Jasper Tudor arrived too late to join the king's army before Ludford, but seems to have volunteered to pursue York and his youngest son, the Earl of Rutland, across Wales, but they escaped to Ireland. And it's easy to see how the king's presence and the pardons issued after the submission of Devereux and Herbert in 1457 caused some people to hesitate when the Yorkists rallied their forces in September 1459. Ludlow or Wigmore were safe havens for York's power, but his tactics had brought a mighty royal army into the region. Escape deferred his challenge to Henry VI and left his regional followers leaderless and vulnerable to reprisals. Walter Devereux and Richard Lord Grey of Powys were left to lead the humiliating submission of York's retainers to the king after Ludford Bridge. Families in the Devereux orbit like Lingen, Bromwich, Baskerville, Monington, Witney, Shirley and Hakluyt were drawn deeper under the Crown's scrutiny. All had participated in the Welsh expedition of 1456, and if they were not already inclined to rebel, most would become highly committed to York's cause as 1460 progressed. They formed the core of the army that fought Jasper Tudor at Mortimer's Cross. Devereux's life was spared, but the Coventry Parliament of November 1459 called for his attainder. The king's eventual pardon was a conciliatory step perhaps, but it did not sway his absolute loyalty to York. Thomas Vaughan's contribution had switched from open violence of 1457 to close plotting in the summer of 1459, and he was attainted. But the Herberts seemed to have remained uninvolved in this episode and escaped censure, but some men who were kept their political nerve. So pardons granted before the end of 1459 to Hugh Shirley of Leominster or Richard Croft of Croft Castle, for example, show that they had tried to insure against any turn of fortune. And a few like John Throgmorton of Tewkesbury used this opportunity to move from Herbert's affinity into Crown service. The mismanagement of the campaign of the autumn 1459 did damage York's personal credibility as the national leader. Ludford Bridge was a humiliation for him. And this was national politics unfolding on the local stage. Yet the dispersal of the Yorkist leaders to Dublin and to Calais moved the course of events away from the marches, and the type of confrontation that Mortimer's Cross would become was by no means inevitable as focus switched to the control of London. On the other hand, once local alignments became obvious and damage had been done between families and were then linked to the national crisis, it was likely that the marches would remain unstable until the struggle for the crown was resolved. 1460 began with a period of consolidation for Queen Margaret's leadership of the Lancastrian royal group. The resources of York and his allies had to be taken from their control. If Henry VI's regime was to end high-level conspiracy and rebellion, that process had to produce some clampdown on the violent actions that were seen. But in doing so, they also prompted other violence, as was happened at York's town of Newbury in Berkshire, and elsewhere, his allies resisted. Jasper Tudor returned to Wales to block any attempts by York to link with his Welsh and Marcher allies. He spent months capturing York's castle at Denbigh and securing the lordship there. Other lords like William Herbert kept their posts because of their neutrality the previous years, but commissions in these areas later looked to repeat the carrot and stick approach employed in 1457. After success in North Wales, by May 1460, Jasper Tudor was back in Pembrokeshire, strengthening strong points like Tenby and building the defences of Milford Bay, already identified as a possible landing place for a Yorkist invasion from Ireland or from Calais. The regime also failed in an expedition to push the Earl of Warwick out of Calais over the winter and could do little but wait to see what the Yorkists did. During 9 months in Dublin, the Duke of York's negotiations with the dominant Fitzgerald family excluded all the Lancastrians in the Pale, but it did ensure that he received the backing in men and resources that were necessary to lead an army into England. The Earl of Warwick came to Ireland in March 1460, and the Lords worked out a strategy for the invasion and replacement of Henry VI. To secure popular support, that plan targeted the king's bad advisors, as they saw it. A propaganda campaign prepared the ground along those lines by emphasising the failures of Henry VI's government, and York and his allies became victims of the vindictiveness of a regime dominated by foreign interests, and that was really not benefiting the whole country. When Warwick and Salisbury, with Edward Earl of March, landed in Kent on the 26th of June 1460, they met little resistance. The southeast of the country felt abandoned by a royal court based at Coventry that drew its strength from the north and Wales. And financial pressure and a military clampdown during 1460 had also weakened regional support for the king. So when the Yorkists journeyed towards London, several leading Lancastrians fled the capital, others retreated into the Tower of London. And while the civic authorities there tried to dither and find a compromise, a group of sympathetic aldermen allowed the Yorkist captains into the city by the 2nd of July. After a very quick pause and gathering of a loan to pay for some troops and some more mustering, the Yorkists quickly headed north to intercept King Henry. And at the Battle of Northampton on the 10th of July, he fell into their hands. This was a short and relatively bloodless fight, but nevertheless saw the targeting of Lancastrian leaders like Buckingham, the Earl of Shrewsbury, and Viscount Beaumont, and they were all killed. The Queen and the Prince of Wales escaped into Wales, seeking Jasper Tudor's aid, and she left Harlech Castle for Scotland by the end of October. The prospect of Scottish help in exchange for Berwick boosted her she began to form an army at Hull, and this boosted the assembly by sea and land of various Lancastrian forces in the north. Jasper also refused to surrender those fortresses and lordships he still held, and solid control of the southwest of Wales really provided a good recruiting ground for the regime for Lancastrian loyalists. The Duke of York was still in Ireland and had to impose himself on the victory achieved in his name. York arrived near Chester on the 8th of September and immediately headed for his estates in the Marches, refreshing his power in the heart of his traditional lordship, and encouraged the fealty of those who had helped hedge their commitments since Ludford Bridge, understandably keeping a low profile. York behaved like a king entering his inheritance. He displayed the arms of England, and as he got nearer to London, the arms of Edward III's second surviving son, Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, and this was a direct appeal to the Mortimer network. Whether this approach was part of the agreement reached with Warwick, it left no doubt that York's ambition drove his intention to replace Henry VI, a step that was unnecessary now that government and the king were completely under Yorkist control. A decline in the king's fortunes dismayed some people on the Marches. Certainly on the 13th of August 1460, Devereux was commissioned to arrest Sir John Delabere, Thomas Fitzharry, John Chippenham, and others for spreading slanderous lies about the great men of the realm. Most of the gentry who had ridden into Wales on behalf of York in 1456, however, rallied to him once more, again led by Herbert, Devereux, and Roger Vaughan. Richard Croft became fully committed from this point. They and their followers clearly saw the advantages of being so close to the man who had the right and now the chance to be king. When York reached London, the company of these long-term supporters, he asserted his claim to the throne on the 10th of October. But in this, he gravely misunderstood the mood of Parliament, the Londoners, and the body of lords who had supplanted Henry VI in York's absence. Over 2 weeks of debate followed, during which an increasingly grumpy Duke of York saw his assertions and demands watered down. An accord reproduced the arrangement of 1420, by which Henry V of England became heir to Charles VI of France. With this agreement on the 25th of October, York resumed his role as protector of the realm. Henry VI's son Edward was disinherited, and York and his heirs would be installed as successors once Henry VI died. Proclamations soon promoted this compromise throughout the country. But obviously this made Queen Margaret even more determined to uphold the rights of her 8-year-old son. With northern lords like Dacre, Clifford, and Northumberland very angry at this manipulation of the king, the arrival by sea of Henry Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, with troops from Devon and Dorset, continued the build-up of a royal army at Hull in what was becoming a very large loyalist army. So it seemed like only battle could undo the commitments bound up in this unpalatable act of accord. And at this point, the factors that had been growing since the mid-1450s began to come together. York and Salisbury headed north to recruit troops in their Yorkshire lands and to probe the Queen's preparations. Edward Earl of March returned to the Marches to mobilise the full power of his father's affinity. And with civil war now unavoidable, Jasper Tudor and the Earl of Wiltshire also had to find a way to unite their forces with the Queen's up in Yorkshire. This seemed more likely when York again misjudged the situation he faced. At the end of December 1460, he left the safety of Sandal Castle near Wakefield to drive away an enemy force, only to find a larger army ready to fight. He and the Earl of Rutland were killed, while Salisbury was caught the next day and beheaded. The teenage Rutland allegedly murdered by Lord Clifford in revenge for York's assassination of his own father at St Albans in 1455. The Queen placed their heads over one of the gates of York, with York's royal claim mocked by a crown of paper and straw. So York's death made Edward Earl of March the heir to the throne and heir to York's power. In the Marcher lands, this did not alter allegiance to the Yorkist cause, it probably enhanced it, but Edward's elevated status and his isolation from both Warwick and the other Yorkist lords in London did make him more vulnerable until the Yorkist forces could be united against the Queen's army. Awareness of this situation made it possible that Jasper Tudor's march towards the north, through the lands of York's allies between Hereford and Wigmore, was an attempt to defeat Edward before he could gather his troops fully. If Tudor avoided battle, then the main aim of uniting with Queen Margaret was still achievable. Edward Earl of March, however, probably decided to use his location to prevent Jasper and the Earl of Wiltshire from passing into the English Midlands. The personal animosity between Tudor and Devereux, Herbert and Vaughan certainly ensured that there was some element of deliberate targeting of the Leominster and Webley area as the route from West Wales was worked out. So much of what follows is based on the discussion that's already in print, mainly by Geoffrey Hodges in the 1980s. So I'm going to summarise that and the details of the battle as we know them. Earl Edward of March was probably at Gloucester before Christmas, but at Shrewsbury for the feasts through to Twelfth Night. News of his father's death must have arrived within a few days and accelerated his military preparations. The same news reached London on the 2nd of January, but Warwick held fast, awaiting the next developments. With Devereux and Herbert to guide him in his first command, Edward used Wigmore and Ludlow as strong points from which to monitor the Lancastrians and coordinate his plans against them. Steve will talk more about this retinue later. The third week of January, the Lancastrian commanders must have left Pembrokeshire. The force they had included Irish, Breton and French troops collected in various appeals for aid and voyages overseas. William Worcester's itineraries, written in the early 1480s, provide the only comprehensive list of those on either side at Mortimer's Cross. And this is one of the pages from a Parker Library manuscript of that particular volume. His account shows at some point that the Lancastrians gathered some local support, such as the 4 men of the Scudamore family of Kentchurch. And although not included in Worcester's list, a 1472 petition from Edmund Cornwall of Burford indicates that his father Thomas had fought for Lancaster at Mortimer's Cross and was attainted for it. Edward, with his command of local topography and a traditional role of his father and his familiar followers in defending Wigmore or Ludlow, was able to choose the ground that would help block the opposing force at the end of its long journey. And more of this soon from Anthony. Protected flanks, a river on the edge of the plain, and time to build any defences, to conceal troops in woodland, or to set guns, gave Edward all the advantages of preparation. The Lancastrians would probably have used the Duke of Buckingham's lands in Brecon as protection and perhaps for supply on their journey, which must have taken about 10 days. This was a difficult winter march, and with a hybrid army of unfamiliar units led by Jasper's Welsh squires in increasingly hostile territory, most of the exposed upland routes were probably avoided. The army was relatively small, perhaps only 2,000 or 3,000, and it had not had much time to prepare. The route to Brecon, across the Wye, and then towards Leominster through Kinnersley and Sarsfield would have made intelligence gathering easier at this time of year too. And crucial would have been the knowledge of where the Yorkist force was assembling. An attack on Ludlow or Wigmore probably required very different tactics, although this force had to make do with whatever equipment it carried or could make or could acquire on a journey. Approaching from the south towards Kingsland and the crossroads where the engagement happened also left open a fast route for retreat, and this was a feature of Jasper Tudor's planning in 1471 and 1485. Croft and Webley castles were the residences of his friends, Richard Croft and Walter Devereux. Edward had plenty of options for forward scouting bases as he waited for his enemies to arrive. He would have had fast-riding messengers ready to call his main force onto the battleground he'd already chosen, and the army of 2,000 men that Herbert and Devereux had taken into Wales in 1456 provides a baseline for the size of the Yorkist force fighting in its homeland, but it would have been much larger and certainly more coherent than that of its opponents. The day was likely the 3rd of February, and the weather unusually cold and clear. Chronicle sources like Gregory's London Chronicle and the notes of Abbot Walthamstead of St Albans confuse much of the geography in their short accounts, but most mention the meteorological phenomenon of the parhelion, witnessed by Edward and his troops as they stood waiting the enemy. Since that effect of the sun refracted by ice crystals in the air might have been seen in the coldest early morning, it places the Yorkists on the field, ready and facing to the southeast. The English Chronicle says it was around 10 a.m. that this was noticed, and it was taken as an omen of heavenly favour, to the extent that Edward used this three suns symbol and adopted it as one of his badges afterwards. Details of the actual fighting are scarce. Rising ground on their left and the river Lug on the right of the field, the advancing Lancastrians would have had to endure volleys of arrows and perhaps some gunfire as they tried to get within range with their hand weapons. A focus of fire on their left flank would have had the effect of compacting the ranks towards the centre and then towards the river. Using arrows to sow confusion might have broken up the company still further and created the opportunity for Edward's well-trained and well-armoured fighters to advance from their positions. He fought on foot, as he was accustomed to do, at the centre of his bodyguard and with great prowess and courage. He was clearly an inspiring leader, and his local neighbours and servants were right to offer him their support, and they continued to do so during his reign. The unarmoured Irishman would have really suffered grievously in this engagement, and it's probably at this point, if not earlier, that the Earl of Wiltshire fled the field with the remnants of his soldiers from his estates. Another tactic that Edward later employed at Tewkesbury was a cavalry ambush hidden in woodland and launched onto the flanks of his opponents. Had this happened with riders or archers at Mortimer's Cross, it would have hastened a rout. The breakdown of order in the Lancastrian lines happened at some point, and the area of the battlefield would have expanded as groups tried to escape, but their panicked movements would have been limited by the terrain. The possibility of a last stand, perhaps by the mercenary troops who could expect little quarter, is likely, but many rank-and-file Lancastrians must have escaped, since several captains also survived the day. Jasper Tudor, James Butler, the three of the Scudamore Knights, Thomas Fitzharry, Thomas Perrott, and many others. But others were captured on the battlefield or in flight close by. William Worcester's list of those executed also indicates those taken. Owen Tudor, Jasper Tudor's father, was the most prestigious prisoner, being King Henry VI's stepfather. Owen, along with Sir Henry Scudamore, John Throgmorton, Hopkin Davy, and others of Jasper's followers from Gower and Pembrokeshire, died in the marketplace at Hereford in the days after the battle. We know very little of the Yorkist casualties, but Anthony will say more about that later. Mortimer's Cross probably matched Welshmen against Welshmen, since the Herbert connection brought many mustered tenants from Hergus, Talgarth, Tretar, Usk, and Abergavenny. And since Jasper commanded the troops that his brother had led in 1455-6, and the men that Griffith ap Nicholas had delivered after their accord, and certainly his sons and grandsons were there with Jasper, there is a strong element at Mortimer's Cross of unfinished business from previous campaigns and skirmishes. The difference between the armies was Edward of March's time to prepare and the quality of his affinity men who did much of the slaughter after the archers had disrupted the ranks of the well-travelled Lancastrians and started their panic. Mortimer's Cross was also a regional struggle between the King's and the Duke of York's men, the culmination of 5 years of hostility between the main captains. although it was small in scale, there was bitterness behind the actions of the victors. Partly this might be explained by the battle on their doorsteps and the need to defend the region from the depravities of soldiers arriving from elsewhere. The politically aware commanders also realised that victory made it possible for Edward of March to head to London and press his claim to be king. In an atmosphere of triumph, the captured Lancastrians were beheaded in a series of vindictive executions. Owen Tudor thought he was to be ransomed and only realised his death was imminent at the last minute, in what appears to have been a revenge for the killing of Earl Edward's father in Yorkshire a few weeks previously. And it was only the Earl of Warwick's ill-advised defeat to the Queen's Northern Army at St Albans on the 17th of February that drew Edward from Hereford at this time, and he left 2 days later. Had he travelled sooner, then Warwick might not have tried the disastrous manoeuvres to halt the Lancastrian march on London with an understrength force. Yet this worked in the Yorkists' favour. Defeat united King Henry with Queen Margaret and their Lancastrian courtiers, and with Henry no longer a Yorkist puppet, the Act of Accord seemed irrelevant. Edward and Warwick met at Burford in the Cotswolds on the 23rd of February, and there they probably agreed to discard the agreements over the succession and install Edward as king directly. Some careful manipulation presented Henry VI's involvement at St Albans as evidence that the accord was broken anyway. In fact, he had sat reading and singing under a tree a mile from the fighting. Queen Margaret failed to press the advantage gained by the victory, and the gates of London remained closed. The city's residents were terrified of a force that had already pillaged Yorkist estates on the way south. With Edward and Warwick travelling back towards the capital, the Lancastrians headed north to regroup. On entering London on the 27th, Edward was joyously welcomed and proclaimed as king. He began his reign on the 4th of March, but only a final clash would determine if he would keep his crown for more than a few weeks. His decisive victory at the very bloody Battle of Towton near Tadcaster on the 29th of March did just that. But for the Yorkists, victory at Mortimer's Cross and defeat at St Albans unlocked any conflict of thinking about how or whether Henry VI should be deposed. Edward's victory on the marches set him on the way to the throne, even if it was Towton that ensured his grip on the crown. For the vanquished Lancastrians, Towton cemented their defeat. The King and Queen and Prince Edward all escaped to organise against Edward IV's regime, but it would be a decade before they again challenged him in battle. Of those involved at Mortimer's Cross, Jasper Tudor seems to have borne the burden heaviest. He lost his power and title in Wales to William Herbert. The new Earl of Pembroke also took Jasper's nephew, Henry Earl of Richmond, as a ward. Defeat obliged Jasper to become a restless campaigner for the Lancastrian cause, appearing over the coming years in Brittany or in France, or maybe before the walls of Carnarvon, or aiding the stubborn garrison at Harlech, which did not surrender till 1468. All to little purpose until he briefly appeared during the readaptation of Henry VI in 1470, before 14 dismal years in exile followed. Defeat was also a source of personal bitterness for Jasper. He described the failure to destroy the Yorkist cause as, quote, a great dishonour and rebuke, which he hoped to avenge. There can be little doubt that, had he beaten Edward, Earl of March, and extinguished the Yorkist royal candidates, then the war would have ended in February 1461, with Henry VI still as king. Jasper endured that disappointment over the coming years, with his father's death at Hereford becoming a focus that left little room in Jasper's thinking for conciliation with those he held responsible. As the readaptation ended in disaster at Tewkesbury on the 4th of May 1471, Jasper captured and beheaded Roger Vaughan at Chepstow, an episode often presented as direct revenge upon the man who led Owen Tudor to his death at Hereford. And we get some sense of Jasper's thinking from one of the first things he did when his nephew became king. On the 23rd of August, the day after Bosworth, probably with still troops on the field, he renews his payment of £42 from the farm of Hereford City. This is a symbol of what he felt the city owed to him. And even more pointedly, on the 26th of April 1493, Jasper headed the list of nobles who introduced his grandnephew, Prince Arthur, to the people of the Marches at a session of the peace at Hereford Castle. This is a symbolic transfer of power to the 3-year-old Tudor Prince of Wales as he moved into his new lordship at Ludlow. Practically, it strengthened the royal presence in the region, installing the new regime's heir as a nominal ruler in the country where Mortimer power was strongest and Edward IV's eldest son had been trained to be king. It helped to emphasise Tudor legitimacy and the continuities that the grandson of Edward IV offered. Personally, for Jasper Tudor, this was also an exercise in symbolic revenge, since the ceremonies linked to Arthur's arrival would have occupied the public space in which Owen Tudor was beheaded. Of course, by that date, the prince was proclaimed as the unifying heir of York, Mortimer, Beaufort, and Tudor, even if Jasper could not forget the difficult journey to get to that point. Henry VII's views might have been different, however. His childhood upbringing as a Herbert ward, and then for a while in the household of Herbert's widow, Anne Devereux, at Webley, perhaps provided a slightly different perspective on the march of families he was now king of. But discussion of that is for another time. Specific legacies linked to the battle are harder to pin down simply because there were so many other later events and pressures that influenced behaviour and attitudes. So I'm going to sort of conclude now with an example, but only one example. Late medieval people certainly had long memories, and conservative landed society regularly looked backwards for evidence of past incidents, ancestry, and precedent, for justifications and explanations, but also to enforce their rights and inheritances. Local men who fought for Lancaster might provide the best evidence for some of this, and clues to their identities are found in the jury list for the 1457 sessions at Hereford, and in the list of rumour spreaders that Devereux tried to track down in August 1460. There's not time to investigate them thoroughly, but a quick look at Thomas Cornwall's motives and consequences of his actions might show how complex people's calculations were. Edmund Cornwall's petition showed that his father was imprisoned in Ludlow Castle for several years after Edward IV took the crown. Thomas's pardon came in July 1467, possibly after the efforts of his sister Eleanor, who was the wife of Sir Richard Croft. Croft also received custody of the Cornwall lands during this period of attainder, and that was only reversed in favour of Edmund in 1472 after the death of his father and Edward IV's triumph in the 1469-71 phase of the Civil War. The Cornwalls had a strong, if dormant, family connection to the Lancastrian kings, and an even older one to Richard of Cornwall, King Henry III's brother. This Burford branch were cousins of the extinguished line of John Cornwall, Lord Faneup, who had died without legitimate heirs in 1443. Faneup had married Henry IV's sister, Elizabeth. He became rich during his long military career in France, but many of his grants were for life, including Ampthill Castle in Bedfordshire, and they reverted to the crown when he died. So we might ask, were Fanup's ties to the Lancastrian royal family enough of an inspiration for Thomas Cornwall to ally himself with the king's men in February 1461, perhaps in the hope of reviving this vein of patronage? Thomas certainly moved in royal service by then. He was a king's squire in 1453. In August 1455, he was in Worcester Castle jail with 12 men from Burford, and their arrest could have been linked to local disturbances after York's attack on the royalists at the First Battle of St Albans 3 months earlier. Cornwall was Sheriff of Shropshire in 1459-60. The same year he became Constable of Radnor Castle after the death of Sir Walter Devereux Sr. His brother Otis, who was also on the 1457 jury list, and you can see him down at the bottom, called Otis Cornwall Esquire. He was MP for Hereford at the 1459 Coventry Parliament that attainted Devereux. So clearly the Cornwalls were rising in crown service. So it's questionable how much power that link gave them in those troubled years. Other hints about Thomas Cornwall's decision-making through pressure on his landholding. In 1453, he incurred debts and dispossession in a land dispute with Humphrey Stafford of Frome in Somerset over property in Worcestershire. Stafford was from a cadet branch of the Earls of Stafford and retained strong links to the Marcher region. He married Isabel Delabert and only became a committed Yorkist at Calais in 1460. Isabel was Cornwall's first cousin. Her father, Sir Richard Delabere, was brother to Cornwall's mother, Elizabeth. This suggests an element of opportunistic self-interest in Cornwall's decision to fight rather than to remain neutral at Mortimer's Cross. Targeting Stafford on the battlefield, as many people did in other conflicts, would end a potential line of attack on his estates and his inheritances. And it was only in 1490 that this dispute was actually settled. Relationship with Richard Croft would also prompt further dispute over Brimfield Manor early in the Tudor period, and it's remarkable that within 2 weeks of Walter Devereux, then Lord Ferrers of Chartley, dying at the Battle of Bosworth, the Cornwalls were challenging Richard Croft for influence in Leinster, and here's an example of a trial that later happened, which collects together lots of Cornwall's followers in this event. The resulting violence brought cases before the Royal Council, and it drew in people like Sir William Stanley and the Corbett family of Shropshire, and other people, but also rumbled on into the 1490s. A Marcher link between Devereux's servants and the plot connected to the opening of Parliament in 1487 also means that there's enough here for possibly another 2 presentations. So I'm going to leave that there. And just to sort of wrap up finally, Mortimer's Cross certainly set the framework for these relationships, but it was also the product of some of those relationships falling into friction. And it also carried those relationships far into Henry VII's reign, with the same bubbling relationships between people not being resolved for quite a long time. It has a powerful legacy of the battle because it's perhaps the only battle of the Civil War fought within the home territory of almost all the combatants on one side. The other battles tended to draw people from across the country on very much larger scale. The Yorkists enjoyed the benefit of closeness to the crown through to 1485 after Mortimer's Cross, but it's also fascinating that the man who lost the most at Mortimer's Cross, Jasper Tudor, enjoyed the sweetest victory and ultimate revenge in 1485 when his nephew became king, and he finally swept up all the power he had held and lost over the previous 30 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. That was a brilliant description of the political context and ongoing importance and significance of the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. That's, I mean, really set the scene for the afternoon.
Thank you.
Paul, if you're switched back on, please.
Yeah, I'm here.
Good. Have you received any questions?
Not as yet, although a couple of very positive comments from Sean's talk. I have a question though, if I'm allowed to ask one.
Do you have to declare your relationship?
Well, Sean and I work together at the National Archives. Technically, he's my line manager, so.
I just fill in the forms, Paul. You know that.
Yeah, I know. He's still got to fill in my annual review forms. All I was going to say, Sean, is you've obviously given us some really interesting documents there. Could you maybe say a little bit more about the kind of the archival and kind of the manuscript background in which you've drawn up this talk? What kind of records and chronicles are out there that if we wanted to follow this ourselves, we could potentially to look at?
Yeah, it's a good point, because a lot of what we actually get to is what's in print. So a lot of this material has been worked on when the Victorians were setting up the National Archives, the Public Record Office. They saw this kind of legal and political and administrative collection as the basis for the history of government and the history of the country. So they produced a lot of these texts in print. A lot of it is linked to the technical stages of legal cases, or to grants and administration, and how people held and defended their lands. So it's scattered in terms of its volume. It's very repetitive. Quite often it's triplicated through the processes these records were following. And we tend to have the Crown side of things at the National Archives, and the material sent out to individuals or towns or corporations is out in the county record offices or in private hands often. And we rely on these printed sources to sort of reconnect them often. The great thing about the online world is that some of this is now becoming available either through digitized editions of the books, things like Google Books or medievalgenealogy.org website, or Hathi Trust website now carry digital editions of a lot of these sources, and also of the chronicles, which tend to be produced in monasteries or often by clerics in the civil service around the king, so they're witnessing events but kind of one step removed from the political angle. So there's a lot of those, and obviously the Civil War 1459 to 61 is such a memorable occasion across the country with battles in all sorts of different regions. There's quite a lot of commentary which appears in these monastic records of events. So you can search online. You can use some of these resources through portals like Medieval Genealogy, which gives you links to various places where the digital editions are kept. Websites like the Anglo-American Legal Tradition have lots of digital, about 10 million digital images of National Archive documents from the medieval early modern period, but with no context and no search. You have to basically browse through them as if you were in one of our reading rooms looking page by page. But you can then use that to cross-reference from other sources, from articles or printed editions of texts. So there's a lot out there. I think I'd still use historians' interpretation as a way into the narratives and to cut through some of the less useful information. You'll find that most historians, especially on this kind of topic, people like Ralph Griffiths have spent an awful lot of time getting this information out of the records for us, so we don't have to do the hard work. So, but you can follow up what they've cited, and quite often you'll see then that there's things they couldn't include or didn't want to include. The source might be fuller than we're led to believe from the first citation of it. So it is always useful if you can to have a look at the manuscript. And I know Paul does quite a lot of work to show people how these things look and how you might get to see them. And we'd certainly be very welcoming if anyone wanted to come and have a look at them down here in Kew.
Indeed, we have previously run a Mortimer History Society event at Kew, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
I have actually now got a question though, Sean. So Mark Wilson asks, is it true to say that the factions and relationships forged during 1461 were still in place a century later with the remaining Tudor nobilities? Henry VIII was always still aware that former Yorkists, e.g. the de la Poles, were still a threat.
Yes, he's kind of obsessed with ancestry, certainly until he has an heir. He's very much conscious that there's lots of people in the higher ranks of the aristocracy who have better blood connections to Edward III than he does, certainly in the male line. He'd obviously cite his father's victory in battle as a good enough endorsement of God's favour to deter other people from doing that, and he actually gets the Pope's support in 1486 to excommunicate anyone who challenges him on that basis. But it's clear that certainly till the Battle of Pavia in 1525, Henry VIII is terribly worried about the nephews of Edward IV through the children of Edward's sisters and all of the male nobles they'd married. So the Courtenays, certainly the Marquess of Exeter certainly is one of the key figures who Henry is really worried about. But even people like the Stanleys who've influenced the course of things, certainly at Blore Heath and at Bosworth, and maybe in 1483 when they didn't intervene on the marches to allow Buckingham's rebellion to kick Richard III off. That kind of family who could influence the course of things were also a worry because they could have a candidate who they preferred to the person sitting on the throne, i.e. Henry. So he has to worry about this. And of course, he's still got the Northern Earls Rebellion in Elizabeth I's reign. So even when you put religion into the mix, the kind of more conservative North is kind of reflecting the Lancastrian loyalties of the 1460s in the Northern Earls as well. So it's not almost like things could have repeated themselves had things been different, but obviously the Tudors managed to stumble between reigns and keep themselves in power, whereas the Yorkists didn't.